The daily life of a medieval executioner was a mix of duty, social stigma, and responsibilities far more complex than we can imagine. Far from being limited to exercising violence in the name of justice, these men were respected and recognized figures whose days were marked by the challenge of maintaining a balance between fulfilling their duties, their relationship with the community, and the psychological weight of their work. In this account, we will delve deeply into the most relevant aspects of the life of an executioner in the Middle Ages, from the peculiarities of their trade to the personal and professional challenges they faced daily. If this is your first time on the channel, subscribe now so you don't miss any important content about the darkest chapters of our history. The executioner was not only responsible for executing the condemned. Their role went beyond that, as they had the task of preparing them mentally and spiritually for the final moment. Although not a religious advisor like the clergy, their role in the final stage of the condemned's life involved accompanying them and helping them achieve a kind of redemption. From the moment a prisoner was sentenced to death, the executioner was in charge of their care, which included monitoring their health and, if necessary, requesting a postponement of the execution to ensure the prisoner was in adequate condition to face death. The medieval executioner had to visit the condemned, which served as preparation both physically and spiritually. Additionally, to avoid any complications during the execution, the executioner could intervene in the prisoner's health condition. This meant they also needed basic medical knowledge, as they had to ensure the prisoner was strong enough to endure the process. In a context where medicine was less advanced than today, this care reinforced the idea that the execution should be carried out in an orderly and, as much as possible, respectful manner towards the prisoner. Of course, before each public execution, the community was informed of the date and time of the event. Executioners received instructions on the procedure they had to follow so that the execution would serve as a moral lesson for the community. The spectacle of an execution fulfilled an educational purpose: to warn citizens about the consequences of crime and remind them that the state and the church were watching their actions. The public punishment needed to have an impact on those who witnessed it, provoking fear and respect for the justice system. This educational function was so important that pamphlets were often distributed in advance so people would know when and where the execution would take place. During the time leading up to the execution, the executioner fulfilled another important role, that of conciliator. In an attempt to ease the emotions of the condemned, they were allowed to receive visits from their family members and people they had harmed. This reconciliation process, although shocking to us today, was part of the medieval conception of justice. At that time, forgiveness was considered a divine act, and achieving forgiveness for the prisoner before their death was seen as a form of redemption. Thus, the executioner was, in a way, a mediator between the condemned and the people they had affected. On the day of the executioner appeared in ceremonial attire, which was much more elaborate than their usual clothing. This attire represented the solemnity and importance of their role and reminded those present that the execution was not an ordinary act but an official event of justice. The image of the medieval executioner, covered with a black hood and wielding an axe or sword, was the visual representation of the authority and power of the state. The presence of the executioner at the execution ceremony served as a reminder that, although they were the one performing the act, they were not responsible for the punishment itself. They were merely executing the sentence of the law. The condemned's last meal was a respected tradition. Although not always luxurious, the prisoner could request food and drink to ease their fear of the final moment. Alcohol consumption during this last meal sometimes facilitated the executioner's task, as the prisoner became more docile and less resistant. With this, the prisoner prepared mentally for the execution, and the executioner continued to fulfill their role as an intermediary between life and death. During these moments, executioners shared a drink with the prisoner in what was called the drink of peace, a tradition symbolizing forgiveness between the two. Finally, the moment of execution was not only an act of violence but also a kind of theatrical performance. The public execution had a set script that included the announcement of the prisoner's crimes and the reading of their final sentence. These acts were not only legal ceremonies but also symbols that helped the spectators understand that they were witnessing an act of divine justice. It was, therefore, a function that reminded spectators that crimes did not go unpunished and that justice acted in the name of God and the state. When it came time to execute the prisoner, The executioner had to perform the act quickly and precisely. Their skill and training were key to executing the prisoner with a single blow. However, on occasion, this was not possible, causing deep dissatisfaction among the crowd watching. Failing on the first attempt was a disgrace for the executioner and could provoke unrest. On the other hand, if the executioner performed with precision, they were recognized for their skill and devotion to duty. Once the execution was completed, the executioner had the task of cleaning the area. This included collecting remains and cleaning the blood, which marked the end of the event. The crowd waited until the cleaning was complete, as the event was not considered finished until the site was spotless. This was a sign of respect for the prisoner and the ceremony itself. The life of medieval executioners was not without difficulties. Being seen as people responsible for acts of death, their communities often considered them as figures of stigma and isolation. In some cases, they were socially rejected, and many people refused to interact with them outside of their professional duties. This social burden was a constant weight in their lives, and some executioners retired from the trade after a time to seek other occupations. Despite this social marginalization, some executioners managed to gain respect and consideration. Some even became figures of authority and could establish themselves as doctors or consultants in their communities, as their knowledge of the human body acquired in their profession allowed them to perform these roles. At their death, an executioner who had served their community and justice well could receive an honorable funeral, which made it clear that, although despised by some, their role was fundamental in the social structure of the time. In summary, the life of a medieval executioner was full of complexity and dualities. Although they exercised violence in the name of justice, they also acted as healers, mediators, and spiritual guides. Their work not only consisted of carrying out executions but also of staging a public act of justice that reminded society of the consequences of their actions. The responsibility they bore was enormous, and although they faced social rejection, their role was indispensable to the justice system of the time. The life of a medieval executioner was, ultimately, a mix of solemnity, duty, and personal sacrifice. A life marked by the constant struggle between social isolation and moral responsibility. If you've read this far, you've already learned something new with our stories. Subscribe and activate the bell so you don't miss our upcoming videos. Together, we can uncover and remember the truths that history often tries to hide.